By 2014, my friend Lewis and I had spent years traversing the rugged terrains of Washington and Oregon together. We had survived the scorching southwest deserts and the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada, but the Frank Church River of no return wilderness was our next big challenge. We loaded our gear and drove north from California to Idaho, anticipating a straightforward but long-haul backpacking trip. 2 million acres of untouched land eventually sprawled out before us, dwarfing any landscape we had ever tackled before. We parked our car at a trailhead near the middle fork of the Salmon River, noticing a faded sign warning about bears and fire bans. Our packs were incredibly heavy, containing our food, water filters, and everything we needed to survive in the deep woods. On the first day, we stuck to the established trail, moving steadily through the towering pine and fir trees. The forest was quiet in a gentle way, and we managed to cover 8 miles before setting up camp near a small creek. Day 2 was more of the same as we pushed deeper into the woods, following paths that wound through steep valleys. The underbrush began to thicken, threatening to swallow the trail entirely in certain overgrown spots. We didn't talk much, simply walking and occasionally checking our maps to ensure we were on the right track. By the end of that day, we pitched our tent on a flat patch of ground and boiled water for instant noodles. On the third morning, we felt a sense of restlessness, wanting a more authentic wilderness experience than the trails provided. Lewis suggested we ditch the path and cut cross-country to see what most people missed. As we veered off the trail, the woods changed instantly, turning dense with trunks wider than my shoulders. Roots sprawled out like veins under the dirt, and moss draped over everything, dulling the sunlight. We moved with caution, scrambling over fallen logs and avoiding hidden holes in the spongy forest floor. It felt like we had traveled back in time 1,000 years to a place completely untouched by modern man. Suddenly, Lewis stopped dead in his tracks and tilted his head to the side, listening intently. A second later, I caught it too, a low, steady hum that sounded completely out of place in the wild. It wasn't the wind or water, it was an artificial, mechanical sound vibrating through the air. Without speaking, we obeyed our mutual curiosity and began to follow the source of the noise. The sound grew louder as we pushed forward through a thicket of young saplings. We broke through the foliage and saw a concrete bunker half sunken into a low rise of earth. Its concrete shell was covered in strange scratched symbols, circles, zigzags, and twisting lines. The hum was coming from inside, and as we drew closer, it transformed into the sound of aggressive heavy metal music. Distorted guitars and screaming vocals spilled out through a steel door that hung slightly ajar. We stopped dead in our tracks, just a few feet from the entrance as the violent music pounded against our ears. It wasn't the music itself that terrified us, but the thought of who would be playing it out here in the middle of nowhere. Lewis shot me a look that confirmed he was thinking the same thing. We needed to leave immediately. I nodded back, and we quietly turned to retreat, hoping to put miles between us and that place before night fell. We had only gone a few hundred yards when 2 men stepped out from behind the trees as if they'd been waiting. They wore full camo with their faces completely hidden behind black balaclavas. Each of them held a rifle that looked like an AK-47, gripped tightly even though the barrels were pointed down. My blood turned to ice as we stopped cold, the only sound being our own heavy breathing. The men didn't move, their eyes locked on us through the slits in their masks for what felt like an eternity. Suddenly, one of them snapped his rifle up and barked a command in a flat, cold voice. "On your knees, arms up," he said, leaving no room for debate. I saw Lewis's hands moving toward his backpack straps, and I realized he wasn't going to surrender. In a sudden burst of movement, Lewis unclipped his pack, let it drop, and bolted into the darkness. The sight of him running snapped me out of my trance, and I ditched my own weight to follow him. A loud shot cracked through the air, making my ears ring as bark exploded off a tree right next to my head. I ducked and wove between the trunks, my legs pumping as hard as they could as more gunfire erupted behind us. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard one of the men yell a chilling order to cease fire because they needed us alive. We kept running blindly into the heart of the Frank Church wilderness, knowing our supplies were gone and those men were still behind us. We kept running blindly into the heart of the Frank Church wilderness, knowing our supplies were gone and those men were still behind us. The sounds of heavy boots crunching on dry needles echoed behind us, growing louder with every panicked breath we took. Every snapping twig sounded like a hammer being cocked back in the oppressive silence of the deep woods. Suddenly, a sharp crack rang out through the canopy, and a chunk of bark exploded from the spruce tree right next to my head. I didn't look back to see who fired. I just pushed my legs harder, ignoring the burning sensation in my lungs. Behind us, a cold, flat voice shouted a command that made my blood turn to ice. The man yelled for his companion to cease fire because they needed us alive. That realization was worse than the shooting, fueling a new wave of adrenaline that propelled us through the brambles. More shots followed, but these were aimed lower, kicking up dirt and pine needles around our stumbling feet. We scrambled up a steep, moss-covered ridge, our fingers clawing into the damp earth for any kind of grip. At the top, Lewis paused for a split second to scan the tree line below for the muzzle flashes of our pursuers. Two dark silhouettes emerged from the brush, their rifles held with practiced deadly ease. We didn't wait to see if they would fire again and slid down the opposite side of the ridge into a dark ravine. Branches whipped across my face, leaving stinging welts, but I barely felt them in the heat of the chase. We reached the bottom of the ravine where a small icy stream cut through the jagged rocks. Lewis gestured for me to stay in the water to hide our tracks from whoever was following us. The water was bone-chilling, soaking through our boots and numbing our feet instantly. We moved as quickly as the slippery stones allowed, listening for the sounds of those men descending the ridge. Far above, the aggressive metal music from the bunker still hummed faintly, a haunting soundtrack to our flight. After what felt like miles, we crawled out of the stream and collapsed behind a massive fallen cedar. Lewis leaned in close, his voice a barely audible whisper as he asked if I was hit. I shook my head, checking my limbs for wounds I might have missed in the adrenaline rush. Then the reality set in that we had ditched our packs, leaving everything behind with those men. We had no food, no tent, no sleeping bags, and most importantly, no map to find our way back to the car. The temperature was dropping fast, and my damp clothes began to feel like a shroud of ice against my skin. We heard a distant shout from back toward the ridge, echoing through the trees like a hunting call. Lewis grabbed my arm, signaling that we couldn't stay in one place for long. We began to trudge through the dark, using the stars visible through the canopy to maintain a rough southern heading. Every shadow seemed to morph into a man in a balaclava, waiting in the darkness with a raised rifle. The night dragged on in a blur of shivering and stumbling over unseen roots and rocks. My stomach began to groan with a hunger that I knew wouldn't be satisfied for a long, long time. We found a shallow cave-like indentation in a rock face and huddled together to share what little body heat we had left. Neither of us slept, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of a flashlight or a cigarette glow. I thought about our pistols sitting in our abandoned packs, now likely being handled by the very men who tried to kill us. As the first hint of gray light touched the sky, we stood up, our joints stiff and screaming from the cold. We needed to find water soon, or the dehydration would take us before the militia did. Lewis pointed toward a distant valley where a thicker line of trees suggested a larger river. As we descended, the feeling of being watched returned, crawling over me like 1,000 tiny insects. I heard a metallic click from the bushes to our right, a sound too deliberate to be a natural part of the woods. I froze, my heart stopping as I saw the glint of a steel barrel emerging from the leaves just a few feet away. I stayed pinned to the forest floor, listening to the heavy thud of boots retreating into the thicket. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the gunfire that had preceded it. Lewis hissed my name from behind a mossy cedar, his face a mask of sweat and dirt. We didn't dare speak aloud, knowing that our attackers were still somewhere in the darkness. My back felt unnervingly light without the weight of the pack I had carried for miles. Everything we needed to survive, our food, our water, and our shelter, was now in the hands of the militia. We began to trudge south, guided only by the fading glow of the horizon and a raw sense of direction. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my feet as the thin socks offered no protection against the jagged stones. The first night was a brutal reminder of how quickly the Frank Church wilderness can turn deadly. I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line, certain I could see the glow of cigarettes or the glint of a rifle scope. When dawn finally broke, it brought no warmth, only the realization of how far we still had to go. My stomach cramped painfully, a hollow reminder that our last meal was nearly 24 hours ago. We found a small bush of huckleberries, but they were bitter and offered little sustenance. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot echoing through the canyons. By the second day, the forest began to lose its beauty and became a labyrinth of hostile green. Lewis stumbled over a hidden root, falling hard onto the dusty trail. I helped him up, noticing the jagged scratch running down his forearm where the splinters had hit him. We found a stream but drank sparingly, fearing the parasites that might lurk in the untreated water. As the sun set on the second night, the temperature plummeted once again. I heard a low metallic hum in the distance and wondered if the bunker was closer than we thought. Hunger had turned into a dull, constant ache that made every movement feel like an impossible task. On the third morning, the trees began to thin, and the smell of wood smoke drifted on the breeze. We pushed forward with a final burst of adrenaline, ignoring the blisters and the fatigue. A small wooden ranger station appeared like a mirage through the heat haze. I practically fell against the door, my knuckles raw as I pounded on the wood. The ranger who opened the door was an older man with a weathered face and a look of immediate concern. He ushered us inside and immediately began pouring 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. We blurted out our story between gulps of coffee, the bunker, the music, and the men in balaclavas. The ranger's face darkened as we mentioned the scratched symbols on the concrete shell. He told us that the Frank Church had a long, violent history of anti-government militia activity. These groups sought the isolation of the deep woods to train and hide away from prying eyes. He explained that we were lucky to be alive, as those types of groups don't leave witnesses. Local police arrived an hour later, their expressions skeptical as they took our statements. When the search party returned from the coordinates we provided, they found the bunker completely empty. No gear, no weapons, and most importantly, no sign of our stolen backpacks. It was as if the men in their fortress had simply vanished into the timber. We drove home in a heavy silence, the Idaho landscape looking more like a prison than a park. I couldn't shake the feeling that those men were still out there watching for the next trespassers. The mountains of the Frank Church had kept their secrets, and we were the lucky ones who got away. But as I looked at the map one last time, I noticed a strange, dark shadow moving across the California coastline. A long time ago, my buddy Andre and I decided to tackle the legendary Lost Coast Trail in Northern California. We had been hiking since the early morning, laughing about stupid things from work and enjoying the isolation. By noon, my legs were screaming for a break, and I could tell Andre was feeling the exhaustion too. We found a little clearing off the path with a big flat rock that looked perfect for a rest. I dropped my heavy pack and pulled out my water bottle, taking a long, satisfying swig. Andre unfolded the paper map, muttering to himself as he traced our progress with a dirty finger. Suddenly, a massive shadow slid over us like someone had flicked a giant light switch. It wasn't just a small patch of shade, it was large enough to cover the entire clearing in an instant. I froze mid-sip, water dribbling down my chin as I slowly looked up toward the sky. But the sky was still that perfect, endless blue with absolutely no clouds in sight. Andre stopped talking and snapped his head up just as the shadow finished passing over us. He whispered, "What the hell was that?" with a voice that sounded genuinely rattled. My eyes darted around the horizon, scanning the treetops and the open air for any explanation. There were no planes, no large birds, and this was long before drones were a common sight. I didn't know of anything that could make a shadow that big and move so incredibly fast. It had been completely silent, gliding over the landscape without a single sound of an engine. Then a sudden breeze hit us, coming out of nowhere and feeling unnaturally stiff and cold. It didn't feel like a normal coastal wind, it felt like it was trailing whatever had just passed over. I felt the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up as a wave of dread washed over me. Andre had gone pale as he spun around, looking in every direction for a physical threat. We stood there in total silence for a minute or two, waiting for the sky to fall. My heart was thumping at a mile a minute, and I could hear Andre's ragged breathing beside me. The entire woods had gone completely quiet. No birds, no bugs, just an oppressive silence. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the shadow to return. "We should go," I said, and Andre didn't even hesitate to agree. He stuffed the map into his pack, and we started moving back toward the trailhead immediately. We didn't even bother sticking to the trail. We just headed straight back through the brush. I kept my eyes locked on the sky, half expecting that massive shadow to descend again. Every light breeze or rustle of leaves made me jump as if a monster was at my heels. It took us about an hour to get back to the parking lot, though it felt like an eternity. Andre's beat-up old Ford truck was still there, right where we had left it in the morning. We threw our gear into the truck bed and scrambled inside, locking the doors immediately. For a long time, we just sat there, catching our breath, staring out at the silent tree line. Andre finally broke the silence, trying to convince himself it was just a large bird. He muttered about hawks or eagles flying low, but his voice lacked any real conviction. I just nodded along, even though I knew deep down that no bird could produce a shadow of that scale. That shadow had been too big, too solid, and moved with a smoothness that wasn't biological. We drove back to town in a heavy silence, the radio filling the space with country songs. When we got to my place, Andre didn't stick around for a beer like he usually did. That night I couldn't sleep, replaying the moment the light vanished over and over again. I spent hours online searching for unexplained shadows in the woods and silent aerial anomalies. Most of the theories I found were just blurry photos and wild conspiracies that didn't fit what we saw. Andre and I still hang out, but we don't hike anymore, and we never speak of that day. There's a sort of shared secret between us now, a quiet pact to forget the thing that made us feel so small. But as I looked at the map one last time, I noticed a strange dark shadow moving across the California coastline. The mystery of the California coast shadow faded into the background as a darker report arrived from the Pacific Northwest. In late autumn of 1983, a young hiker named Terry Fishgold vanished into the emerald depths of the Olympic National Forest. He was an experienced woodsman carrying enough supplies for a 3-day solo trek near the Hoh Rainforest. When he failed to return by Sunday evening, his family alerted the authorities, sparking one of the most baffling searches in the region's history. Search coordinator Miller organized a team of 20 skilled trackers to sweep the area where Terry's car was found. On the first day of the search, the weather turned unusually cold, bringing a thick, choking mist that clung to the trees. The trackers reported a strange silence in the woods, as if the local wildlife had completely vacated the valley. By the second afternoon, the team found the first piece of evidence: Terry's red backpack lying perfectly flat in the middle of a trail. Strangely, the pack was empty, but all the zippers were neatly closed and the straps were tightly buckled. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuff marks in the dirt, and absolutely no footprints leading away from the bag. Miller pushed the team deeper into the rugged terrain of the High Divide, fearing Terry had become disoriented and shed his gear. 3 miles from the backpack, they found Terry's left boot perched on top of a jagged rock spire 60 feet above the ground. The cliff face was sheer and slippery with moss, making it impossible for a human to climb without specialized equipment. Even more disturbing was the fact that the boot was tied in a complex decorative knot that Terry was never known to use. A sense of paranoia began to spread among the searchers as they realized they weren't looking for a lost hiker, but something much stranger. On the fourth day, the search moved toward a remote drainage pipe near an old logging road that had been decommissioned for decades. One of the K-9 units began barking frantically at a hollow cedar tree that had been split by lightning. Inside the narrow vertical cavity of the tree, they discovered Terry's flannel shirt, shredded into perfectly identical squares. Forensic analysis later showed the cuts were made with molecular precision, far cleaner than any surgical scalpel could achieve. Despite the shredding, there was not a single drop of blood on the fabric or the surrounding wood. The search was expanded to include helicopters, but the dense canopy of the Olympic forest made aerial observation nearly useless. Pilots reported seeing flashes of metallic light coming from the deepest ravines, but nothing was found upon ground inspection. 1 week after the disappearance, the team reached a high-altitude plateau known for its treacherous, shifting shale. There, in the center of a snow-dusted clearing, sat Terry's metal compass, still spinning wildly in every direction. The Rangers noted that their own electronic devices and radios began to emit a low-frequency hum when they approached the clearing. Near the compass, they found a circle of small stones, each one bleached perfectly white as if they had been submerged in acid. The search was officially called off after 10 days, with the local sheriff concluding that Terry must have fallen into a hidden crevasse. However, 2 months later, a group of mountain climbers found something that reopened the case with a terrifying intensity. On the summit of Mount Olympus, an area inaccessible to anyone without advanced ice climbing skills, lay Terry's skeletal remains. The body was missing all of its long bones, including the femurs and humeri, leaving the rest of the skeleton strangely intact. There were no carnivore marks, no signs of scavenging, and the clothes were missing entirely. Investigators were baffled by how a man without boots or gear could have ascended 10,000 feet of vertical ice and rock. The coroners noted that the remaining bones showed signs of extreme heat exposure, as if they had been briefly touched by a plasma torch. Miller, now retired, still spends his nights looking at the photos of the impossible search and the things they found. He recalls the sound he heard on the final night in the woods, a sound like 1,000 metallic wings beating at once. It wasn't a bird, and it certainly wasn't a helicopter, but it moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics. The Terry Fishgold case remains officially unsolved, categorized as a misadventure despite the glaring physical anomalies. Locals still avoid the High Divide, claiming that the trees themselves seem to move when no one is looking. They say if you find a red backpack lying flat on the ground, you should run and never look back. But the anomalies weren't confined to the Olympic forest. Further north, a surveyor was about to stumble upon a site that drained the very color from the world. The anomalies weren't confined to the Olympic forest. Further north, a surveyor was about to stumble upon a site that drained the very color from the world. Elias had spent years mapping the jagged ridges and boggy lowlands of the Yukon interior. He moved with the practiced ease of a man comfortable in absolute solitude. On a late August morning in 1993, the familiar geometry of the woods began to warp. The spruce trees ahead were no longer standing vertical, but leaning outward as if pushed by a massive, invisible hand. As Elias stepped through the final line of trees, the vibrant greens of the forest vanished instantly. Before him lay a perfect circle of death, where everything had been drained of its natural hue. The shrubs, the dirt, and even the towering trees within this boundary were a ghost-white ashy color. It wasn't the charred remains of a fire, nor the crystal coating of frost. The very essence of the life here seemed to have been siphoned away by an unknown force. The air within the circle was unnaturally still, devoid of the constant hum of insects or the rustle of birds. Elias felt a sharp chill crawl up his spine as he moved toward the epicenter of the clearing. In the exact center of the blighted ground sat a small, shallow crater. There were no fragments of a meteorite, no signs of heat, and no evidence of human interference. He had the distinct, prickly sensation that he was being watched by something unseen and deeply unkind. Despite his growing dread, the surveyor's instinct for documentation took over. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the lens cap, the plastic clicking loudly in the dead silence. He snapped dozens of photos, capturing the blasted trees and the void-like crater from every angle. Every click of the shutter felt like a heartbeat, and he knew he needed to leave immediately. The site felt wrong on a fundamental level, as if it didn't belong in this dimension. Elias began the long trek back toward the ranger station, pushing his body harder than usual. Within 2 hours of leaving the site, a dull, thumping headache began to pulse behind his eyes. He stopped to drink from his canteen, but the water felt like lead in his stomach. Sharp knots of nausea twisted in his gut, making every step an agonizing struggle. By the time the lights of the ranger station appeared, Elias was drenched in a cold, sickly sweat. He barely reached the porch before his body revolted, a hot rush of sickness hitting him with terrifying speed. Pete, the ranger on duty, found him swaying and pale, his eyes sunken and glassed over. The world began to blur into a series of disjointed voices and the crackle of a radio calling for medical help. Elias awoke in the back of an ambulance, the hiss of an oxygen mask the only sound in the sterile cabin. He tried to tell the paramedics about the white trees and the crater, but the words were a jumbled mess. Days in the hospital passed in a haze of beeping machines and the cold sting of IV needles. The doctors spoke of rare viral infections and insect bites, but Elias knew they were just guessing. Once discharged, he immediately went to his headquarters to retrieve the proof he had risked his life for. He waited in the break room while the darkroom tech developed the film from his camera. When the tech returned, his face was a mask of confusion as he laid the prints on the table. Every single photo of the impact site was a white fuzzy blur of static, as if the light itself had been corrupted. The photos taken before he found the circle were perfectly clear, mocking his lack of evidence. His superiors gave him looks of pity, clearly believing the site was a hallucination brought on by fever. Years later, Elias still scans every forest he enters, dreading the sight of another color-drained clearing. But the bleached circle was only one type of anomaly. Elsewhere, a hiker was about to realize that some gaps in the woods aren't physical but mental. The hiker felt the weight of his keys as he tossed them onto the passenger seat of his sedan. He had been feeling cooped up in the city and desperately needed the silence of the trees. He reached into his tactical bag and checked the seal on his large water bottle. The drive toward the Black Pine Loop was a solitary trek through miles of encroaching forest. He watched the pine trees blur into a continuous wall of dark green needles. The gravel crunched loudly under his tires as he finally pulled into the small deserted lot. A faded wooden sign marked the entrance to the trail, its paint peeling like dead skin. He stepped onto the dirt path, feeling the initial crunch of dry leaves beneath his boots. For the first few minutes, the hike was exactly the escape he had been searching for. Then, the world suddenly shifted into a jarring, static-filled void. His next conscious thought was the cold sensation of the steering wheel against his palms. He blinked rapidly, realizing he was already miles away from the trailhead. The sun was no longer high in the sky, but dipping low behind the horizon. He searched his mind for the last few hours, but found only a black, impenetrable wall. Later that night, he sat on his couch staring at a beer he had no memory of opening. He could remember the gravel lot and the faded sign, but everything after that was gone. The feeling of missing time gnawed at his gut like a physical hunger. The next morning, he woke up with a head that felt like it was filled with lead. His gaze drifted to his hiking boots resting by the front door. The leather was caked in thick black mud that hadn't been there when he started. He knelt down to touch the dried sludge, finding a strange metallic smell clinging to it. He began to check his body in the bathroom mirror, looking for any sign of a struggle. There were no bruises or cuts, but his skin felt unnaturally cold to the touch. He decided to visit a doctor, unable to handle the uncertainty of his mental state. The physician performed a battery of tests, checking his pupils and reflexes. Every result came back normal, suggesting a perfectly healthy mind and body. Driving home, the hiker felt more isolated than ever, as if he existed in a different reality. He spent the next few hours scouring obscure online forums for mentions of Black Pine Loop. He found a thread from a man who claimed the trees there were twisted by an unseen sickness. The post described a specific stretch of the trail where the compasses began to spin wildly. He suddenly remembered a single flash of memory, the sound of 1,000 birds stopping their song at once. He began to feel as though he was still being watched, even within the safety of his own home. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of a distorted, dark path. A loud thud from the hallway sent him bolt upright in his bed. He grabbed a flashlight and slowly edged toward the source of the noise. There, lying in the middle of the floor, was his hiking backpack, which he had left in the car. He realized the zippers were undone and his water bottle was completely empty and bone dry. He hadn't touched that bag since he got back, yet it was here, inside his locked house. He checked his front door and found it bolted, with no sign of a forced entry. As he turned back to the backpack, he noticed a wet, muddy footprint on the carpet leading directly into his bedroom. Growing up in Utah meant the vast red rock wilderness of Farmington Canyon was practically our second home. The drive up was always a test of nerves, with the narrow dirt track squeezed between jagged rock walls and a vertiginous drop. On this particular trip in the mid-90s, my dad had surprised us by opting for a tent instead of our usual cabin. We spent the evening laughing and roasting hot dogs over a crackling fire as our two dogs chased each other through the brush. As the stars emerged, we doused the embers and crawled into our thick sleeping bags, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the nearby stream. My sleep was suddenly shattered in the dead of night by the sound of a low, vibrating growl from one of the dogs. Then I heard it clearly, the unmistakable crunch of heavy footsteps on the dry leaves just inches from my head. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs as a slow, deliberate shadow passed across the side of the tent. The intruders circled us with agonizing slowness, their weight shifting the ground as they investigated our campsite. The dogs were now barking frantically, their aggression rising as the footsteps paused right at the tent's zipper. Suddenly, the footsteps broke into a run, retreating into the darkness of the woods as if the noise had finally spooked them. My father sat up instantly, his face pale and eyes wide, whispering for us to get ready to leave right now. We tore down the campsite in record time, stuffing gear into the car without a single word of conversation. As we pulled away, I looked back and saw a pair of eyes reflecting the taillights from deep within the tree line. The long drive home was silent, the terror of the canyon finally behind us, but the memory forever etched in our minds. We never found out who was circling our tent that night, but we never returned to that campsite again. The wilderness had taught us a harsh lesson about the things that watch from the shadows of the deep woods. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, buried in the silence of the canyons where the echoes of footsteps never truly fade. Our journey into the unseen shadows of the forest ends here, leaving only the rustle of leaves to tell the tale. May the woods keep their secrets, and may those who wander them always find their way back to the light. The muddy footprint on my bedroom carpet eventually dried and vanished, but the chill it left in my heart remains. I realized then that the anomalies we encountered weren't just stories, but a part of the hidden world we live alongside. I have made my peace with the unknown, knowing that some paths are simply not meant for human feet. The hikers from the Frank, the surveyor in the Yukon, and the searchers in the Olympics all share this silent bond of survival. We are the witnesses to the impossible, the ones who return from the edge of the abyss. The heavy metal music from the bunker has long since faded into the wind, replaced by the natural sounds of the creek. My house is locked, the windows are shut, and the shadows here are just shadows, nothing more. I'm thankful for the safety of the city, for the paved roads and the streetlights that keep the dark at bay. Yet, a part of me will always listen for that specific crunch of leaves, that unnatural hum in the air. The world is much larger and stranger than we often care to admit in our daily lives. We carry on, moving forward through the years, but the forest stays behind us, ancient and unchanging. Perhaps one day these mysteries will be understood, but until then they remain our private ghosts. This is the end of our accounts, the final record of the echoes from the deep woods. Let the wind carry the rest of the secrets away into the mountain peaks. We close the book on these stories, but the shadows will always remain for those who dare to look. Sleep soundly tonight, for the forest is far away and the doors are locked tight. The long night of the soul is over and the sun will rise on a world we think we know. I'm content to let the mysteries be, resting in the quiet comfort of the known. Farewell to the shadows, and farewell to the deep woods. The story is finished and the echoes are finally silent.